Proposition 64.
So that's also me again. This will be my last one. So Proposition 64 is related to marijuana, so I'll provide a little bit of background on current marijuana law. Marijuana is generally illegal under state law, and penalties range from a fine for possession to jail or prison time for sales. However, in 1996, voters voted to legalize the use of marijuana for medical purposes. In addition, the state recently began adopting a new round of regulations that would put a greater level of regulation on the medical marijuana market. With respect to federal law, however, under federal law, marijuana is illegal, including for medical use, even in states that have voted to make it legal. However, the current administration and the U.S. Department of Justice chooses not to prosecute individuals that are obeying state law, so long as those laws are written and enforced in a way that upholds federal priorities, such as ensuring that marijuana isn't diverted to other states or ends up in the hands of minors. So now I'll talk a little bit about how Prop 64 would change current state law. Prop 64 really has four main parts. First, it would legalize the non-medical use of marijuana for adults who are 21 and over, with certain exceptions. So for example, folks could smoke in their home, but generally they couldn't smoke marijuana in places in the public or where it's illegal to smoke tobacco. Second, it creates a system for regulating non-medical marijuana. This system of regulation would be largely similar to the system that the state has recently begun to adopt for regulating medical marijuana. Third, it imposes excise taxes on the cultivation and sales of marijuana, and it requires that most of these funds be spent for specific purposes such as youth programs, environmental protection, and law enforcement. And fourth, it generally reduces penalties for marijuana-related crimes with certain exceptions. So for example, the penalties for driving while intoxicated by marijuana would remain unchanged. Now, with respect to the fiscal effects, there's a high degree of uncertainty around them, and this uncertainty really stems from three different factors. How state and local governments choose to regulate marijuana. The measure gives a lot of discretion to locals, for example, and if a lot of local governments banned the consumption of marijuana, it could significantly affect the fiscal impact. Whether the federal government chooses to enforce marijuana laws, the current administration chooses generally not to enforce them, as I mentioned earlier, but a new administration might make a different choice. And how marijuana prices and consumption change following legalization. Bearing in mind all those uncertainties, we estimated that there'd be net additional state and local tax revenues that could eventually range from the high hundreds of millions to more than $1 billion annually, though most of these funds, as I mentioned earlier, would be dedicated to specific purposes. And it could take a while before that total revenue amount materializes. We also estimated that there'd be net cost reductions, potentially in the tens of millions of dollars, due to less spending on criminal justice activities, largely related to a decline in the number of folks in jail and prison related to marijuana crimes.
So in support, we have, I think, 420 different organizations. The California Democratic Party, come on, nobody, really? Okay, all right. The California Democratic Party, the California Peace and Freedom Party, other Democratic clubs, LGBT clubs. The Republican Party is in opposition, and the Libertarian Party in opposition. In support, we have the ACLU, African American Alcohol and Drug Council, Friends Committee, Drug Policy Alliance, Project Cannabis, surprisingly, a whole lot of organizations like that. NORML, which has been working on this for years. And then in opposition, we have hospital associations, police organizations, sheriffs, district attorneys, ministries, and something called the Weed for Warriors Project, which sounds like it would be on the other side. And then opposition, a number of city councils that are opposed. And support, we have Gavin Newsom, Barbara Lee, Mark Leno, Tony Atkins, so a number of Democratic elected officials, Kevin McCarty from here, Darrell Steinberg, our future mayor, so a number of elected officials, mostly Democrats. And then in opposition, we have Senator Feinstein and a number of state elected officials and federal elected officials, mostly Republicans, and some city and county sheriffs. It's a split for the media organizations. And then the money, 16.8 million almost in support, and a little over 2 million against. So we have Sean Parker, who's another internet bazillionaire company. Weedmaps.com, I looked it up. So it's a place where you can find where to get weed. So they would do well, I think. And then against, we have some individuals, highway patrol, police, hospitals. Questions?
How does this legislation compare to the Colorado legislation, and how is Colorado doing with their present marijuana laws?
There are similarities and differences. Obviously, they both legalize marijuana, but there's a lot of technical differences between the two. So, for example, under Prop 64, while medical marijuana would be exempt from sales tax, my understanding is in California, Prop 64 would exempt medical marijuana from sales tax, but largely tax it at a similar rate other than that. Whereas in Colorado, there's significant differences between the levels of tax placed on medical and recreational marijuana. So there's quite a bit of technical differences between the two. In terms of how Colorado is doing, I don't know if you had any specific questions about things that are going on there.
In terms of law enforcement, are there any problems, or what have they had to deal with?
So they're still in the initial stages of implementation, so I think it'll probably be a while before the effects are widely known. And there's some conflicting information about what's happening there. So for example, there's a federal survey about marijuana use that suggests that there might have been some increased marijuana use among the younger population. However, there's some data collected specifically by the state of Colorado that suggests otherwise. So I think in a lot of ways, for a lot of these questions, it's a little bit early to tell what the full effects are.
Over here.
Does this include any kind of regulations regarding the quality or what's in it or the edibles? And because I think that's why Senator Feinstein is against it. But
so there are restrictions on the amount of the active component of marijuana, THC, that can be in each serving size of edibles. However, there's a lot of specifics, implementation questions that will have to be worked out by both state and local government.
Okay, thank you.